On a quiet night in a rural Iowa town, a family of 6 and 2 young girls were brutally murdered in their home. With no witnesses and a tainted crime scene, the identity of the killer remains unsolved. Today, we dive into the history and suspects of the Villisca Axe Murders. This is Red Web. Welcome back, Task Force, to another episode of Red Web, the podcast all about unsolved mysteries, true crime, and the supernatural. I'm your resident mystery enthusiast, Trevor Collins, and joining me, hearing this case for the very first time, Alfredo Diaz.
This is sad.
It's a little sad.
This is terrible. It's a family and a big family at that. And then 2 others?
2 young girls, that were visiting for the night.
Like a sleepover? Come on, man. This is where I'm like, look, if when I pass away, death needs a strong right hand, you know what I mean? Like a Ghost Rider type character to walk the earth and dispense vengeance. I'm there. I'll do it.
Okay, I thought you were going to slap death when you see him. I thought that's what was going to happen.
I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that.
How dare you?
Death will hit me with the backhand of eternity. I'm going to get smacked to a whole nother
He said, okay, you're walking this plane forever.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're going to be his right-hand man. You're going to be called Life.
Yeah.
What are you doing now?
Dispensing justice, essentially.
Okay.
Vengeance. I'm your person. I will be the tortured soul to walk the earth and go after these people. Okay.
A little Constantine-esque?
Less Constantine, more like you're bad, like I'm the boogeyman then. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, like that Disney Channel original movie.
Here we go again.
I'm bringing it back.
Channel. There's got to be a Disney Channel original kids horror movie that we need to add to Movie Club.
Yeah, we do. It's called, hold on.
It's called Blank Check. Terrifying.
It's called Don't Look Under the Bed, and it's a real movie, and it's good, and we're rewatching that for Movie Club. October 9th, 1999. Everyone remembers when it came out.
Oh my God. Oh my God. We're back to
I
that
was
one.
there.
Never mind.
You were there. Listen, if I need to dispense some justice, though, from a corporeal realm, Alfredo, how am I conjuring you? What am I burning? What am I saging the room? Like, what happens?
Well, I feel like I want to keep that a bit of a secret because then everyone's going to blow up my spiritual hotline. You know what I'm saying?
Okay. Yeah, Christian, you just open a Spider-Man comic and he arrives. That's I'll just be honest with you. That's what it is. If it's got Venom in it.
Yeah, if it's got Venom, I'm definitely there. But I feel like it's got to be more incognito and less known to the public because you're going to have a bunch of Karens being like, this person across the street has a little chip on his fence and I want vengeance. And I'm like, ma'am, that's not enough for vengeance, okay?
That's not an HOA compliant color on that fence.
Right. That's an HOA situation to be handled, not a, right hand of death. Strike down my neighbor.
We just don't know. Okay. We just don't know.
We don't know, but I don't need people all around the billions blowing up my spiritual minutes.
You know what? Fair enough.
I feel like you could find me, then it's a real situation, right? Like,
okay.
You needed me badly.
Okay. I like this. I like this developing lore. We're moving into the afterlife now. We're making plans.
Yeah,
but
we are.
I think it's time to bring it back to center. We have a few shout outs to make because we have an amazing task force community out there. So huge shout outs to our Patreon members, Noah Noss, Vixen, Broman, Sabrina Hall, Mitch W, Gavin Day, and Lo K.
And those Patreon members are enjoying Movie Club over on our Patreon channel, but we are going to have Movie Club Scarathon. Yes, we're doubling up on Movie Club. So we're going to have one every single Friday this month. And don't forget, if you want an annual membership, it's 10% off.
10% off. You're eating good this October with spooky movies. Don't Look Under the Bed coming soon.
Yeah.
To a movie club near you.
Look, the range of movies, amazing and absolute trash, but both fun in the same way.
What did I say? From classic to crap?
Yep. From classic to crap.
That's what I'm going to start saying.
But people love terrible horror movies.
It's an amazing niche. Very few genres are out there that it's like, well loved to be bad,
It really is. And I feel like a lot of people, I don't know, maybe it's just like, 90s blockbuster times when I grew up, you just look at a cover, maybe read the back. I didn't read the back. And I go, okay, I'll watch that. And it was terrible. And you're okay with it.
Yeah. You look at the pictures on the back, and that helps.
Exactly.
But also to celebrate Halloween and everything going on this month in October, if you want to support the show, the other way to do that is at store.redwebpod.com. We have some ghost merch out, some embroidered hats, some crew neck sweaters, shirts. We got a mug out there now, a matte black mug with some ghosties. And of course, the Red Web Films posters are back. Those were exclusive to a live event we did many years ago. They are now available to everybody online, so go check those out. But without further ado, let's dive into the Villisca Axe Murders. We have a lot of sensitive topics, so please check out the description to see what those are. And now, Fredo, I'm going to take you back to the night of June 9th, 1912. A family of 6, as well as their 2 guests, were killed in their sleep in the town of Villisca, Iowa. The victims were parents Josiah and Sarah Moore and their 4 children, Herman, 11, Catherine, who was 10, Boyd, who was 7, and Paul, 5 years old. Among the children were sisters Lena Stillinger and Ina Stillinger, 12 and 8 respectively. These young girls were nearby neighbors and friends of the family who had arranged a sleepover that night. Now, the family was discovered when their neighbor, Mary Peckham, grew concerned after noticing the family's absence from their morning chores. This is that old 1900s neighborly activity. Somebody's out on the porch, they don't see things happening next door, yard work, what have you. So Mary becomes concerned. She goes over, decides to knock on the door. After receiving no response, she calls Ross Moore, who was Josiah's brother, and she shares her concern. So Ross then comes over. He's also a local in Villisca, and he arrives at around 8 a.m. He too found no response after knocking on the door. So of course, after a beat, he listens, he hears nothing, and he decides to use his spare key to unlock the front door. He then goes inside, and that's when he discovered the bodies of the Stillinger sisters downstairs in the guest bedroom. He then immediately leaves and calls Marshal Henry Horton, aka Hank, who then came to the house and conducted a complete and thorough search of the home, after which he confirmed not only the death of the Stillinger sisters, but also the entire Moore family. Per his initial reports, all victims had been bludgeoned to death. The Moore family and their 2 visitors had been murdered by an axe sometime between the hours of midnight and 2 a.m. This axe was believed to be the Moores' own axe from their coal shed, as it was discovered at the crime scene later by investigators. All of these victims were found in their beds as if peacefully sleeping. Each had an estimated, and this is where it gets wild, Fredo, 20 to 30 blunt force trauma wounds to each of the victims by the suspected blunt end of the axe. So we're talking about a very high emotion crime on our hands.
Yeah, this is, oh my God, that is excessive, terrifying. It's just so unfortunate. And I wonder, like, in those types of situations, if the first person, you know, as the killer goes in order, this is all very brutal and visceral, but as the killer goes in order, like, are these people being silently killed in the middle of the night? Or, you know, there's a good chance at some point someone's yelling and screaming, and then it's just chaos and people are just getting cut down. And then, you know, it's like, if someone takes an axe to you in the middle of the night, yeah, it's going to hurt, but I mean, maybe they hit you in the neck or the head and it's just boom, you're done. It's, you know what I mean? But waking up and not knowing and panicking and then maybe getting slashed a bit, and it's like, it seems far worse as to not knowing, right?
Oh my God, right. I mean, that's one of the most terrifying parts of this particular case, is that not only do all the victims look like they were peacefully sleeping as if they weren't aware of it, right? And I think that's part of the dark upside, is that maybe these victims never saw it coming, and so maybe they didn't suffer anything. But the fact that somebody's eking through the house silently, and we'll talk more about how the scene was found and how the investigation unfolds to tell more of the story. This just feels like such an emotional act, almost so brutal. Like there must be some sort of motive here or something guiding the hand that took over on this crime. But slinking through the house silently is such a terrifying vision to behold. So dark and sinister.
Yeah. And I always like to oddly put myself in these situations because it just, I don't know, invokes kind of emotions and different trains of thought here. But I mean, one, you got to think that there's something really wrong with this person.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah.
And then two, thinking here, like if I have that many kids, 2 is max for me. But if I have that many kids and if none of us put in that situation, I would just pray that like I'm the first one awake to try and deal with that situation. Or if like a house full of friends and family or whatever, I'd pray that I'm the first one there. If it's a house full of loved ones, right? Friends, family, whatever. And like a handful of us would be able to wake up or something like that, you know, I'd be like, look, I'm going to charge at this guy. It's going to be what it is. Y'all better grab this guy. It's just an axe. You know what I mean? Like, I'll take the first hit. It's going to be what it is. But when that happens, y'all grab a hold of him and beat the living out of this guy. Like, stomp his skull in.
Yeah. Just go ham on this dude. You can't stop a horde of individuals.
Exactly. Unfortunately, like, you know, it's a mother, it's a father, and it's a bunch of young kids.
Yeah.
But I mean, if he's walking in and there's like me and the Red Web Squad, or me and my high school friends, like, can't stop all of us. You know what I mean? We're gonna have to roll the dice and then just beat the hell out of this dude. Like, what other option do we have?
Yeah. I mean, if you can become awake for it, which is why I think you need a Ferris Bueller type system, a string attached to the door, attached to your arm or something. Mm-hmm. So when it opens up, your arm goes up, you know, some sort of Home Alone trap with bells and jingly items.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, yeah, I don't know. It's such a haunting case with such a visceral aftermath.
It really is. It's like worst case scenario.
Absolutely. And what's worse is the things that were found kind of paint an even more sinister plot that unfolded at this house, which to me indicates that there's at least some sort of intentional motive here, or obviously something very emotional between this individual and the family that honestly we don't ever come to an end on, but it does inform on some of the suspects. So it seems that, of course, coming back to the victims, there was 20 to 30 blunt force trauma wounds on each of them by the blunt end of the axe. And it seems that after the initial blows that killed each of the individuals, so maybe it was 1 to 2 hit kind of going through the family and the guests, it is believed that the killer then returned to then cause more damage to their skulls, whether it be to cover their tracks or just because they were brutal and emotional and whatever, and just wanted to continue with this violent act. But then after continuing to obliterate these unfortunate individuals, again, this is post-mortem now, They then covered their heads with sheets, blankets, and clothes. Now, there are conflicting reports on whether or not the Stillinger sisters also received these additional injuries, or if they were only killed and left then alone by the original trauma wounds. It's one of those older cases, it's over 100 years old, and so finding that information can be a little hairy. It's also worth noting that the ceiling in the parents' bedroom and the children's room was low enough that if a grown individual swung the axe upward with a lot of vigor and intent, they would hit the ceiling, and there were a lot of large indentations believed to be probably an accidental consequence of the upswing of the axe. But again, it just paints a very visceral image of what went down that night. And no evidence suggests that any of the Moore family had awoken before being murdered, which to me then solidifies the idea that this person slinked through the house and then kind of took people out one by one, only to then come back, which is wild, and then continue to hack away at each of these victims.
That is absolutely absurd. And I know you talked about in the beginning how this person was never caught, but it's just so sad to see how that person just deserved so much. You know what I mean?
Justice needed to happen. We needed to open up that Venom comic and have Ghost Fredo there on scene.
Exactly. And it's just unfortunate. It's unfortunate that justice wasn't served. Or I mean, you never know. I don't know. Maybe no one knew, but someone found out and then took care of him in the middle of the woods or something like that. But
you never know. Yeah.
You'd assume that like he got away, lived a long life, and then that was a dark secret that they kept with them.
It's very likely. And we've covered a lot of cases like that. Now, coming back to your point where, if you were unfortunately in a situation like this, and I find it hard to not empathize in a situation like this and think, what would you do, right? That's one of the morbid fascinations of true crime. The investigators, when looking at the scene, believed, unfortunately, that Josiah Moore was the first killed, Sarah shortly after, sharing a bed and bedroom, and then their children, before then obviously this individual then went downstairs to attack the Stillinger sisters. But it seems that only Lena, the eldest of the two Stillinger sisters, was found with a bloodstain on her knee and an alleged defensive wound on her arm. Now, if you've ever heard of crimes like this, whether it be an axe, a knife, or anything like that, a defensive wound is when somebody puts their hands up. Usually, if you have a wound on the dominant hand of the palm, that is indicative of a defensive maneuver. You're trying to block something. And so it seemed that if anybody woke up that night, maybe Lena was one to wake up and maybe try to defend herself before, unfortunately, meeting her end. Now, also, investigators noticed that her nightgown was found bunched up near her hips, and this caused a few authorities to be suspicious that there might have been, unfortunately, a sexual motive. However, doctors have found no such evidence of this type of assault, but it is worth noting because, again, it paints a more thorough scene of this crime and maybe help investigators dial in on these various suspects because they all have completely different backgrounds that we're going to talk about later.
Thank God. Because I said like, oh, it's this is the worst of the worst. I'm like, oh yeah, no, this could be much, much, much worse.
Mm-hmm.
And it's wild to think that like someone doing this, and it's not even like the worst it could possibly be that a human likes on another human.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is where I want to go deeper into the investigation. And as always, when you're talking about true crime that are unsolved, it is riddled with hair-pulling frustration events that create maybe the foundation for why it's unsolved. But before we get into all those murky waters, there's a few things that were found at the scene of the crime. There was a 4-pound slab of bacon leaning against the very same wall that the axe, the murder weapon, was leaned up against. A fragment of a keychain, or also reported to be a watch chain, not belonging to anyone in the family. And then 2 cigarettes were found in one of 3 locations, depending on the source that you read, either the barn, the attic, or potentially a closet, indicating that this culprit may have been on site hiding for some time. But also, with regard to these cigarettes, again, it's an old case. Some sources say that these cigarettes never existed at all. But despite that, a plate of uneaten food was found in the kitchen next to a bowl of bloody water. So whether they were hiding on site or not, it does seem to indicate that the suspected killer was on site for at least a little bit of time to wash their hands, maybe eat or attempt to eat, but then left the food. And then either way, another interesting thing was found, Josiah's wallet, which still had the cash inside of it, which indicates that theft, what have you, stealing money was not part of the motive of this crime, that the murders were the main focus of this plot.
Jesus. To do all that and then to like, I don't know, stick around, try and have a meal is absolutely absurd.
It is absurd, but also, do you remember, Christian, what was the name of that case we talked about many years ago? I can't believe it's eluding me, but it's a well-known case where the family was found in the barn, and it seemed that somebody was living in the house for days until the family was found missing or the bodies were found.
The Hinterkaifeck murders.
Yes. So it's not the first we've heard of something like this, obviously not days going by, but maybe at least like an hour or something. But it's so sick and twisted in a way. Ugh. In addition to this, now obviously we talked about this person kind of doing the crime, coming back, brutalizing the bodies even further. Investigators believe that the killer then searched through dresser drawers for pieces of clothing that could either cover glass on entry doors, but also mirrors that were visible in the home. It's worth mentioning that there's no confirmed reason as to why they might have done this, but one of the main suspected reasons is that the killer covered the reflective surfaces, fearing that the family may become aware of their killer's presence. Maybe this individual didn't want to see their own reflection while it was happening. But also, in our research, we found that covering mirrors has been a practice at this time for wakes and funerals, indicating that whoever this was might have kind of proactively said that this is an active funeral because I am killing these people, so let's cover these mirrors. Either way, it just continues to get more eerie. I hate the feeling of describing this environment.
Yeah, this one's a rough one to hear about. And then it's just insult to injury when, this person is stalking around the house after doing such heinous crimes, consuming food, and I don't know, just overall touching stuff. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know, like, don't touch my... It sounds weird, but like if someone was to come in and do that kind of stuff, like I'd be even angrier in the afterlife. They would just start touching all my stuff. I'm like, Jesus, man, like how badly did you just want to inflict pain on someone, and just like how messed up are you to just continue to stay in my house and then touch my things?
Right. Don't go riddling through my sock drawer. You already just bashed these individuals apart, and now you're kind of like fumbling through their items.
Yeah.
Washing your hands off, maybe eating their food. That's like...
It's just so insulting.
It's salt to the wound, 100%. Now, what's interesting too is that there feels like a lot of premeditation in play, and that only becomes more apparent when you realize that there's some evidence that suggests that the suspect entered the home, took one of those old school oil lamps used for obviously lighting a house, and that's what they used to light their way through this home as they stalked this family. To further improve their stealth, it seemed that they wanted to minimize potential awareness. Again, coming back to the reflections idea. And maybe they didn't want reflections of this light on the windows. Maybe that's another thing here. But it seemed that they removed the glass chimney from the lamp and placed it under a chair, which what that does typically is it allows the flame to be bigger and more solid, so there's less flickering, but also more brightness. So that's one way to kind of minimize how bright this light could potentially get. But they also took the wick and bent it over, and so that way it became shorter. These are both actions that serve to minimize the light. That way nobody maybe in their sleep could be disturbed by it, but they could still see as they skulked through the house.
Yeah, it's just calculated and like eerie.
Now, to add to this quiet terror that befell the family that night, neighbors never reported any screaming, any cries for help, or anything coming from the house that night. It seemed that whatever went down, of course beyond what we know, was very quiet and methodical. Now, these are all clear facts and pieces of evidence discovered at the scene, but as I hinted at earlier on, this crime scene was tainted and any further evidence may or may not have been lost. So let's talk about that. After finding the bodies, Horton brought in 3 separate doctors as well as a coroner and a Presbyterian minister. Among the doctors was F.S. Williams, who would be the one to examine the bodies and calculate the time of death. Now, as he's doing this, a crowd of curious onlookers, neighbors and townspeople gathered outside the house, and Dr. Williams actually emerged after doing his investigation, and he states to the crowd, quote, "Don't go in there, boys. You'll regret it until the last day of your life." But then, unfortunately, what followed was as many as 100 curious onlookers entering and walking through the house, leaving numerous fingerprints and potentially disrupting any evidence yet to be discovered.
I am so upset for this family.
I am flabbergasted.
Like, I don't know what's more insulting. Probably the latter, but the killer going through and walking around the house touching my stuff, or the neighborhood going in there and witnessing such a personal situation and what are you doing? Absolutely infuriating. We've done so many episodes and I still think, sometimes I say to myself, we've heard it all. And then we get another crime, true crime, and it's just I've never heard about this. Hundreds of people walking through the house of a crime scene. Who the hell is in charge here? Why aren't they taking control? This is absolutely absurd.
It's unhinged. Listen, I have a morbid fascination with the unknown, with true crime, just as much as the next person. But when a doctor walks outside after investigating the bodies and says, "Listen, folks, you're not want to go in there. It's gonna haunt you for the rest of your life. Please don't go in there." And then suddenly, 100 people go, "Oh, I'm gonna do that." And on top of that, there was one report that states that part of Josiah Moore's skull was taken from the scene. So who knows what else might have gone missing that could have been integral to the investigation. And the crowd only dissipated, to your point. Police did eventually arrive on scene. They were able to gain control of the crime scene, but it wasn't until they showed up and added kind of to Horton's little contingent that they were able to get people out of there.
That is wild, dude. That is
so disrespectful.
Wild. It's a tour. It turned into a tour.
Right.
Like a haunted house tour.
Oh, and we're going to get there.
And this is like a visceral crime scene where 8 people and 6 of them were young or children. Holy.
And they're in there still. They're human bodies, and everything at the scene was as it was, because this was just hours after.
It's just frustrating. That sucks, and that really sucks. You hope that that's just something that they don't have to ever, family doesn't ever have to know. You know what I mean? If there was no afterlife or whatever, you kind of just trying to think at least they don't know that happened. Well,
the Stillinger parents do. That's the unfortunate part.
Yeah, that's the unfortunate part, right? There's still the 2 that slept over, and then their parents, and oh man, dude, I can't even think about how to feel about that.
I know. And now I'm just thinking about Mary Peckham, the nosy neighbor. This sounds like a trope, Yeah. In this case, yes, her nose was up to good where she came over and she happened to allow somebody to stumble into, oh no, this was a terrible event. But on any given Sunday, maybe the family might have just been sleeping in and you got Mary Peckham knocking on the door at 7 a.m. Hey, I don't see you outside. Maybe, you know what? I don't want to totally obliterate this poor woman because I don't know who she is, but I hope she wasn't stumbling through this house or I don't know. I'm conflicted between this nosy neighbor. Listen, and sometimes it's for good, right? And we discovered this scene, but then also it's the 99 other nosy neighbors that went trouncing through it, leaving fingerprints, stomping blood everywhere, taking pieces of skull and God knows what else.
Dude, it's just absolutely insane that this is what happened. It's so
literally I'm speechless. I keep grabbing my face.
I can't, right? And I'm throwing my hands in the air.
Yeah.
How do that many people go through a crime scene? That's wild.
Yeah. Do you think anybody else washed their hands in that filthy, like, blood bowl? Just, these are sickos, that you have to think someone did.
And then just there's this gossip being fueled for God knows how long. And
oh yeah, we're gonna get into that because this then became a religious divide in Villisca between two sides of different churches where they're all pointing fingers at different individuals. But also, and to your point about the paranormal and taking a tour, this is a hotspot, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the very end after the suspects. But it is a paranormal hotspot to this day, and in a weird turn of events, it is a place you can go tour now. Of course, it's not a hot and active crime scene. It's over 110 years later, but it is interesting. It's one of those true crime cases that makes a hard pivot into the paranormal realm. But to kind of elucidate and expand upon just how viral, if you will, and morbidly curious the neighbors were, there was a funeral that was held shortly after on June 12th, 1912. Thousands were reported in attendance, and the funeral procession was as long as 50 carriages. So really, like, whether it's morbid curiosity, stupid fascination, or just genuine remorse and empathy for these families, I'm sure a lot of that is happening in this town. I don't want to paint everybody as like the nosy neighbor getting their fingerprints on the crime scene, but I'm sure the emotions around this are high. And again, we'll talk about this too, but this is part of a wider string of axe murders that are happening around the nation. And in the suspects, we'll talk about how maybe this is part of that, or maybe it isn't. But again, tensions and emotions are very high because of all that background.
I mean, yeah, it's a lot of people, but you'd think that this isn't like an ant's worth of a town, or it's just very tiny. So yeah, there's a ton of people. And I'm sure those people that walked through got a little bit of hate, which was deservingly so.
I'd hope so. Just a little bit.
It does make me feel better that everyone turned out to mourn for these people.
Yeah. To offer a little bit of closure in such a devastating event for any surviving family members. Of course, like we mentioned, Josiah's brother, Ross, was at the scene, as well as the Stillinger parents and extended family on both sides. Like, a lot to think about. This episode of Red Web is sponsored by Rocket Money. Task Force, let me ask you a question. Can you name every single subscription you have? I know I can't name all of mine. And I know I'm not alone. I guarantee it, Task Force. It's okay. Be honest with yourselves. Because did you know over 74% of people have subscriptions they've forgotten about? Well, with Rocket Money, you don't have to remember every single little subscription or purchase you make, or worry about forgetting any, because you can see all of them laid out right in front of you. Rocket Money is the personal finance app that helps you find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps you lower your bills all in one convenient location. And you can grow your savings account, which is more important now than ever. RocketMoney.com/RedWeb is a way to sign up and do that. And there you can see all of your subscriptions in one place and know exactly where your money is going. For anything you don't want, Rocket Money can help you cancel them with a few taps. Rocket Money will even try to negotiate to lower your bills, sometimes by up to 20%. And Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year on average when using all of the app's features. So stop wasting your money on things that you don't use. Cancel all your unwanted subscriptions and check out your finances at rocketmoney.com/redweb. Once again, that's rocketmoney.com/redweb. And one more time, just in case, I want to make sure you heard it. rocketmoney.com/redweb. This episode of Red Web is also sponsored by you, the Task Force, our PBS of it all. We are mainly fueled by you, our patreon.com/redweb members, to be specific. That is a place where we upload bonus content, including our ad-free version of this show. We have Movie Club, especially right now going on. We have the Halloween Movie Club Scare-a-thon. So every Friday this month, we're uploading a movie club. So that's double the normal episodes to kind of celebrate the spooky season. We have Discord events. We have polls to make sure that your voices are heard if you ever want to submit episodes to us, whether it be for Movie Club or for mysteries or what have you. A lot is going on. And again, it is the best way to support us for as little as $5 a month. And if you sign up for a full year, you get 10% off. You can also support the show in other ways, such as merch. We have some new fantastic Halloween merch out, little ghosty merches. So we're going to have like a coffee mug and a hat and embroidered crew neck sweaters and things. That's over at store.redwebpod.com. Again, these are all the many ways you can support us directly and keep us going into this indie world. So thank you all so much for being Task Force members. And honestly, if you're listening right now, all the way here at the end of this shout out, thank you too, because just being here, just listening to us is enough to support us. But these are other ways that you can go above and beyond and make sure that we stay stable and strong going into the future. So thank you very much. Let's move now kind of into the suspects because, interestingly, this is where the case continues to open. There's a lot of interesting events that come to play. Let's talk first about the case's only tried suspect. This is the only person who was indicted and taken to court for this case. I think you know the ending because it is unsolved. But that doesn't mean that this journey isn't wild. This is the story of Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly. Now, Reverend Kelly reportedly arrived in Villisca for the first time on Sunday, June 9th, the day of the murders. Now, he was the son and grandson of English ministers, and Kelly was assigned to be a visiting minister at several small communities north of Villisca, where he reportedly developed a reputation as a kind of odd man, and we're going to see a lot of that. He attended a Sunday school performance the very same day that he arrived in town, the same day as the murders, and this was put on by none other than Sarah Moore, with her children and the Stillinger sisters playing prominent roles in this performance. Kelly then actually left Villisca around 5 a.m. by train the following morning, which by the coroner's estimations would have been very soon after the murders, because those were again somewhere between 12 and 2 a.m. Now, later reports would be coming in the following years during the trial. I want to talk about those. One such report stated that Kelly told fellow passengers on that train on 5 a.m. when he left that there were, quote, 8 dead souls back in Villisca, Iowa, butchered in their beds while they slept. And again, to really hammer home this point, this was a time when nobody had found the bodies yet. Nobody knew that this crime went down, but he's telling people before it's broadly public, reportedly, right? Another report, according to Iowa Cold Cases, stated Kelly returned to Villisca 2 weeks after the murders and supposedly disguised himself as a detective to join a tour of the crime scene with a group of investigators. It was also reported, in addition to all this...
What?
Let's go back to it, yeah.
What?
Man pops on eyeglasses and a mustache and says, "I'm somebody else," and peruses the crime scene as if he's some sort of investigator.
It seems like a scene from a Netflix original cop drama or something like that.
Like if Hallmark went into true crime.
What do you mean? First off, like put on an outfit to disguise himself as a detective and then join the detective tour? Like, What are these tours?
Right. Also, why are we calling it a tour, you know?
This is a wild one in such a different way.
Yeah. This is a very interesting individual, and I'm going to be very curious when we finish the discussion around him in particular, what your emotion says, what your pragmatic mind says about this particular suspect. Now, it was also reported in these trials later on that the Reverend sent a bloody shirt to the laundromat just a week after the murders in a nearby town called Macedonia. It's about a 40-mile drive by modern-day car, about, 30, 40 minutes. At the time, he's taking a train, not too much different, but it is quite nearby. Now, these are all reports that paint a more vivid story, but why was he indicted in the first place? Because again, so far, these are all just reports that happened in trial, but up until this point, and at first glance, it seems like Kelly would be an unlikely suspect. He stood at 5'2", weighed about 119 pounds, quite small build, and was also ordained by the church, so one would think that there's a high level of morality there. However, Kelly himself was the one who generated a lot of suspicion with authorities directly. He was writing them in the weeks following the murders, and he showed a very deep and morbid fascination with this case. Following Kelly's letters, there was actually a PI, a private investigator, who wrote him back asking what he knew about the murders to kind of just suss this whole situation out. Kelly then wrote back in detail, listing that he heard sounds coming from the house that night and possibly witnessed the murders. And I'm thinking, What do you mean you heard sounds from the house that night? Were you nearby? Were you there? You witnessed something, but you didn't say something? This is why the police started getting very interested in him as a suspect.
Rightfully so. This is all very weird.
Now, this is where things get a lot more complex because Kelly had a known history of mental illness, and this then caused investigators to question the legitimacy of his claims and his statements, and ultimately because of this, they decided to not pursue him any further, just taking his claims as falsehood and said, well, let's just stick to the case that we know, follow the facts. 2 years after the murders, in 1914, investigators looked into Kelly again after reports of him sending obscene material via mail. This, quote, obscene material was rambling letters addressed to one Jasmine Hodgson, who was a woman who responded to Kelly's ad in the newspaper for a female stenographer to do confidential work for him. So she's like, listen, I'm a stenographer. You know, one of those folks that sit in courtrooms that can type on it's like shorthand. It enables them to type at a very fast rate so you can record spoken word into writing. She goes, yeah, I can do that for you. But that's when things got weird, and the letter that was written to her was described as so lewd and so obscene that she then reported it to police. I don't know what was in this letter, but it had to be pretty heinous.
I would think so.
Yeah. And it's because of this letter that he was then actually investigated. Again, this is like 2 years later, and so this brings him back on the table. Now, after his arrest, it's worth noting that he was sent to the National Mental Hospital, St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., but Kelly was eventually indicted by a grand jury for the murder of Lena Stillinger and was interrogated through the summer of 1917 after a long wait for a grand jury to assemble. So 3 years after the initial arrest and commitment to St. Elizabeth's, he was finally interrogated in 1917.
Jesus, that's so long. I mean, well, you can't really put a time on it, right? If you find the person, you find the person. That's, you know, even if unfortunately it takes 20 years, justice is justice.
Yeah. And I guess it was pulling together a grand jury, etc. But on August 31st of that year, Kelly confessed to all 8 murders. It was reported that Kelly had recently done a sermon based on the text, quote, slay utterly. This text is found in Ezekiel 9:6 of the King James Bible, and I'm going to kind of quote it here, and it states, slay utterly, old and young, both maids and little children and women, but come not near any man upon whom is the mark, and begin at my sanctuary. Then they began at the ancient men which were before the house, end quote. He also adds, per his confession, the phrase slay utterly had been in his mind for days, almost like an obsession. Additionally, during his confession, Kelly reportedly whispered, quote, suffer the children to come unto me. Now, other reports still state that Kelly confessed he had killed all 8 of the individuals because of a command from a, quote, shadow, the voice of God, end quote. So, of course, this now brings in a lot of questions. You have a lot of spirituality behind this, which could maybe help elucidate us as to why this was so visceral, maybe why this was so tumultuous, because he felt like he was on a mission. But also because of this, a lot of people started to question Kelly's sanity when he was answering some of these questions. And it is worth mentioning, he was never deemed unfit to stand trial, but it doesn't stop a jury from going, hey, listen, I'm not sure if he's in his right mind for this. That said, Kelly's wife and several other witnesses testified that Kelly had a, quote, weak mind due to overwork. So take that as you will. It's a very, very complex moment here. A lot to unpack with Reverend Kelly.
Yeah, it's rough, you know what I mean? Because it's just like, is this person just spewing nonsense because there's nothing but nonsense in their head? Or is this nonsense actually tied to what happened that night?
I mean, that's the crux of it, you know?
Yeah.
Now, importantly, during this trial, Kelly recanted his confession. And jumping forward a few days or weeks, September 26, 1917, Kelly's case went to the jury. The jury was then deadlocked 11-1, a hung jury, as it were, and it was in favor of an acquittal. Now, because of this, they need a unanimous decision, so a second jury was immediately summoned, but also then acquitted Kelly in November. So there was, that November, a unanimous acquittal, and he was then found not guilty. This then leads us to other suspects, but again, Reverend Kelly was the only person tried, and the only person that kind of went to court. Everybody else was more of a, well, this is my theory based on this, that, and the other. And there are a lot of suspects, but we're kind of talking about the main few. because they have a lot more surrounding evidence, a lot more meat to talk about, because with a giant case like this, just to face it, there's going to be a lot of suspects, and some are just super flimsy or not much else to say about it. But Task Force, I encourage you, as always, if you're interested, there's a deep well of other suspects to kind of go look at. But again, with that said, I feel like we should dive into the next suspect. So with Reverend Kelly in our rear view for now, let's talk about Frank Jones, who was a state senator, a local businessman, and a prominent member of the Villisca's local Methodist church. During the time of the murders, a religious divide overtook Villisca. This is kind of what I was hinting at earlier, and this is according to Ed Epperly, who studied this case for over 60 years. So it seems that the Methodists rallied behind Jones and insisted on his innocence, while the Presbyterians were convinced of his guilt. Although Jones's involvement never went further than being investigated, his campaign to maintain his own innocence, as well as the rival push to prove his guilt, kind of ruined his political career. Regardless, it demolished his personal life. So what led to Jones's involvement, right? Well, Josiah Moore worked under Jones for 7 years. He was a valued salesman of the Jones Farm Equipment Company. However, Moore quit in 1907, and it's been suspected that he quit over harsh work environments, long hours, and working 6 days a week. And on top of that, Moore then opened up his own farm equipment company, the Michael Scott Farm Equipment Company, and took Jones's biggest client, John Deere. And so there is a foundation here of ruffled feathers. And honestly, I feel like this combination of quitting combined with the huge loss of clients just felt very personal and caused this huge rift between former friends. And that is the motive behind Frank Jones.
That's a lot of motive.
A lot of motive. It was also rumored that Josiah Moore was having an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, Donna Jones. Now, interestingly, this stems from public knowledge of Donna's numerous affairs arranged over the phone. It's worth noting that during this time, calls in Villisca had to be placed through a phone operator, so at least one or several individuals can notice a pattern coming from one Donna Jones between her and other rendezvous individuals. And so it became kind of public gossip that she was known to have various affairs. And so whether or not she was involved with Josiah Moore is kind of hearsay, but people are kind of connecting the rumor mill with what happened here and trying to build a story.
Oh my God. This is, there could be some weight to it, but it's just a lot of hearsay and gossip. And
100%. It could 100% be true, but we just don't know.
Yeah.
Now, it is worth mentioning that Jones was 57 at the time, and it's 110 years ago, so 57 is different then than it is now. So a lot of people were like, oh, well, he's too old to commit the crime and murder people.
Oh my God.
Yeah, well, many people disagree. They're like, listen, he is very capable of such a crime. Among those was James Wilkerson, a detective at Burns Detective Agency. However, Wilkerson's theory in 1916 was that Jones hired a hitman named William Mansfield to kill the family. So to build his case, this detective gathered evidence against Mansfield, citing that in July 1914, he was the primary suspect in the axe murder of his own wife, his own parents-in-law, and his own infant child in Blue Island, Illinois. He also claimed that he was the culprit behind the axe murders in Kansas 4 days prior, as well as another axe murder in Illinois. Wilkerson noted that each axe murder case was nearly identical, and so if Mansfield was likely for one, he must be behind them all. But I'm going to kind of park this idea for the next chunk of suspects, because this opens up an entire other can of worms. The logic is sound. If they're all so similar that you think that they're all done by one, and you think William Mansfield did one, that's where Detective Wilkerson is coming from. But we'll open up this axe murder spree a lot here in just a bit. Now, Mansfield had an airtight alibi for the night of the murders, as payroll showed him working hundreds of miles away on that June night. Regardless, townspeople like Ross Moore and the Stillingers' father, Joe, maintained the belief that Frank Jones was guilty for several years following the murders. Whether he hired a hitman, whether it was him himself, many people say, I don't care, he's got the motive, he's the guy that did it. But that's where the suspect story ends for Frank Jones.
If he's clocked into work, that's a pretty strong alibi. It's not an ironclad alibi, but a solid one nonetheless.
To be clear, this is the alibi for William Mansfield, which would be the supposed hitman.
Oh, got it.
So it doesn't fully clear Frank Jones, but again, nothing else can be kind of connected to Frank Jones to this. I mean, yes, Josiah Moore worked for him, and we have the rumblings of motive, but otherwise, like, there's no evidence pointing to him. And so, again, he maintains a suspect status. No further investigation was really carried out that we're aware of.
Yeah, not enough there.
Now, as we head into our final discussion of the suspects, it's worth noting that there are countless suspects for this case. It became so big, with so many names thrown out, we encourage you all in the task force to dig deeper if you're interested, as we are mainly discussing the more likely suspects, the individuals with more surrounding evidence, and things of that nature. But with that said, the final suspect, so to speak, in this case is unknown. And this is where I want to speak more to the wide swath of other axe murders that happened at that time, because some believe that the Villisca Axe Murders were tied to a string of 9 other axe murders that occurred in the Midwest in 1911 and 1912.
Like, there was just a spree of them during this time?
Yeah. In these 2 years, there were 10 total. This is per researcher Beth Klingensmith. I want to give her a full credit because she did all this research. And she notes that these 10 murders all occurred near railroad tracks, including Villisca. There were a few outliers that were outside of the Midwest, like Rainier, Washington. Monmouth, Illinois was not near railroad tracks either. But either way, yeah, there were 10 axe murders that all looked very, very similar in this area.
That is so wild. I mean, I guess, sometimes when one person does it, maybe a copycat does it, or I don't know. That's more like recent times with like digital media and people like hearing stuff about each other, but also during those times, you can get away with a lot of this stuff a lot easier than you can today.
Right. You don't have cell phones to ping. You don't have CCTV cameras and doorbell videos. And
no DNA analysis on this, I don't believe. No, it's way too late. So, dude, like if you committed a heinous crime in a city and then just drove away, did it somewhere else even further, don't really go for a pattern of like, I'm going every town west of this line. You know what I mean? Like, how are you going to catch that person unless they majorly slip up?
I know, that's what it feels like. But honestly, I have to commend authorities from this time period. Of course, there are many, many cold cases from this time period. True crime is bustling with cases like this. But also, it just makes it all the more impressive when they can stitch together the things that are similar, that you can build kind of a pattern, and also find people, right? I think in modern times, we have a lot more tools, which makes it a little easier perhaps, but also criminals can be more sophisticated themselves. But yeah, it kind of makes me go, wow, I'm kind of impressed by how a lot of these cases from this time period are solved.
Yeah, it's a lot more manual.
100%. It's definitely drawing those red webs on the cork board. All that red string was stock for red string, was up through the roof those times.
Booming.
It was booming. But you said something that was very interesting to me, because that kept coming to my mind that undoes some of the logic here. Like, yes, it could absolutely be somebody who is doing the same thing along the railway lines, whatever. But also, there could be a copycat out here. We're not disproving the idea of a copycat. Somebody hears a crime like this, so they perpetuate. One of these could be a copycat. Half of them, they could all be 10 individuals. It could all be one person. That only just muddies the water, but that's one thing I didn't really hear discussed a whole lot in the suspects. A lot of people are saying these all look similar, therefore it's one, which is logical. But I don't know. I've seen enough copycats now to make me go, maybe not.
I mean, it's not like there's some kind of specialized, like a sniper or something like that. It's an axe. It's readily available.
Very true.
It's a very intimate weapon, and you don't need training really,
Yeah.
Even then, it's like this person was hitting the ceiling, so.
Yeah, I mean, that does play into the hand of like, it's a commonly accessed tool, like you said, and maybe they were unwieldy with it because it was just someone that used it that wasn't familiar with it. I don't know.
Yeah.
So let's now talk a little bit more detail about these cases so I can paint a more vivid picture of what we've kind of hinted at with William Mansfield. So Justice Department Bureau of Investigation Special Agent Matthew McClowry, long title, pointed out that the first murder in this entire string was a family of 6 in Colorado Springs in September 1911. 2 more incidents followed, including one in Ellsworth, Kansas, where 5 were slain. 2 more people were killed in Paola, Kansas, where Roland Hudson and his suspected unfaithful wife, Anna Hudson, were killed just 4 days before the Villisca murders. McClowry's prime suspect was Henry Lee Moore, a man with no connections to the Moore family. Henry Moore had killed his grandmother, Mary Wilson, and his own mother, Georgia Moore, in December of 1912. So this 10-crime spree kind of lasted 14 months or so. McClowry believed that this was Henry Moore's final killing and that he was responsible for the entire string of 9 murders committed up to this point, although this was never confirmed. Now, with regard to Henry Moore, he was released from Kansas Reformatory shortly before all these murders began, and then he was arrested in Missouri shortly after they ended, so the timeline seems to line up. So if Special Agent McClowry is saying, you did the final one, I can definitely pin you for that. So therefore, my logic is if they're all similar, you've done them all, and they started after you got out, and they stopped when you went away, therefore, I'm convinced it's you. Now, it is believed that the motive for killing his family was to secure the deeds for the family house. Now, if that's the case, it raises a question. Did they just end up in his crosshairs as he's going on this killing spree? Did he have motives for the other crimes because they were kind of unrelated? At least the Villisca murders were. Or, I mean, they're a killer. They don't always have reasons. They're kind of unhinged in that way. They're just going about hurting people. Yeah, I don't know. Now, either way, however your opinion wants to slice it, many people are still caught up on the strange connections between all these 10 cases, right? The fact that they were murdered in their beds at night by axes. It is a popular tool at the time, to your point. It wasn't the most unusual thing, but it's unclear if these victims were bludgeoned in the same manner as the Villisca murders, and so there is some wrinkles within it, right? It is a logical assumption to make, but it's still an assumption at the end of the day. But to kind of like drive this home, as we end the discussion on the suspects and the other axe murder crime sprees, the similarities that really stood out to investigators were the scenes of the crime, and so I want to outline those before we end. In 4 of these 10 cases, the killer covered the victims' faces. In 5 of these cases, it appeared that the killer stayed in the house long after the murder, and in 2 of these cases, a lantern was found with a missing chimney and a wick bent down. So some of these similarities are specific enough to help expound upon the logic of that assumption, but again, like, it's not all 10, right? At most, it's 5. So varying similarities across all of these. I'm very curious on your thoughts before we move into the paranormal aftermath of this gruesome true crime murder.
I mean, honestly, even though it's not in every single one, right? They're so unique. Mm-hmm. Like the whole wick thing on the candle.
Absolutely. I'm like, you're thinking to take the chimney off so you can use the light, but not as bright, and then you're bending the, like, that's wild. That's so specific.
So specific. It like, in my mind, I would think it's less coincidence and more it's the same person.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one.
Like, that's just so specific.
Yeah. Staying in the house long after, maybe.
Maybe, but I mean, still, like, you know?
Yeah.
Not everyone has the, look, it's a different layer to commit a crime like that and then also stay in the house, right? A lot of people, they'll flee. They'll be like, okay, I don't want to get caught or whatever, but to stay in the hole, like, that's an extra added layer that not everyone would actually do. And I don't know, man, this is just, it's too specific. It doesn't matter to me, in my mind, that it's only a couple here and there. I just feel like if they overlay correctly, that they're connected. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting. And honestly, when I think back on this, the Reverend stands out so much that, again, it feels like one of those cases where maybe we got frustratingly close, but we just couldn't close it, or because of extenuating circumstances or other things clouding the air, right? Like, obviously, he was unwell, and so there are other elements in play there. I don't want to fully vilify somebody without knowing everything, but honestly, to me, looking at some of these similarities, the covering of mirrors and reflective surfaces, again, in our research, that has been seen as a religious act at a wake or a funeral. The covering of the faces of each of the victims, that is very specific. I mean, that does happen. Of course, you look at enough crimes, you're going to see that pattern. But like in these 10, to have 4 of them, the killer then covers the face. Again, there feel like these little nods, if only out of habit or out of some sort of ritual, it feels at least a little bit religiously related. And
yes,
so
I think ritual is a good word to use there. It does seem like it's a bit of a ritual. And so that's very specific.
And I think that's honestly what makes this case, of course, we've said this to death, it's gruesome, but it's honestly what makes it all the more terrifying. It's the premeditation. It's the skulking through the house with a lamp that has been modified so you can see but maybe be seen less, covering up windows, covering up the mirrors, killing everybody silently, and then coming back to brutalize the scene. It's just so calculated, so emotional, and honestly, and again, I'm making maybe a leap here, but it still fits where if he's got a scheduled train out at 5 a.m., talking about the Reverend here, and he does this crime from 12 to 2, he's like, everyone's asleep. I'm not going to make noise by going out. I'm just going to lay low here, maybe smoke a couple cigarettes. We don't know if that happened. And then hop on the train. So I've got nothing between now and then to pin me anywhere. And since 8 out of 10 of these happened along railways, maybe that's just what he did.
Yeah, it's enough time.
Oh, it's so weird and sick. But that's the closure of the true crime event, the investigation, and the suspects. Again, task force, so many more suspects to check out. But a lot of them are, there was like a drifter that came into town, somebody without shelter who came through, and a lot of fingers were pointed at them. But there's not much else to go off of. It's that level of depth.
Yeah, it's just maybe just kind of like a whisper of a theory.
Yeah. But with that said, there's something really fascinating here. We both have, for different reasons, fascination with the afterlife, with the paranormal and the supernatural. And this is where true crime kind of turns into paranormal because, of course, we know now the Axe Murders of Villisca, it's considered one of the most notorious unsolved murders in the state's history, if not the country's history. And the house is now owned by Martha Lynn, who is a Villisca local, and she bought the house in 1994 when it was scheduled to be torn down. She wanted a piece of the history to be preserved, even if it's a dark and sinister portion of it. Or maybe she just wanted to have an enterprising business. Because the Moore family home now is a tourable site, and it's been considered haunted for quite some time. They offer overnight stays, and it has been largely popular with many paranormal investigators, like Ghost Adventures, The Most Terrifying Places in America, Destination Fear. Our colleagues over at BuzzFeed Unsolved, they spent the night over there. Many other podcasts and teams have either talked about this place or stayed there. It's very famous, but many of these visitors report, paranormally speaking, disembodied footsteps, children's voices, and seeing strange orbs in photos and videos that are taken throughout the house. I was really hoping, because I'm just fascinated by the supernatural, I was really hoping that we would have more evidence, like photos of full body apparitions, of maybe just kind of like the Amityville house, where that was a murder turned to paranormal. I was really hoping to see maybe a photo that shows maybe one of the kids or that's more detail. Like we have seen that in the Amityville case where there's like a photo and it looks like a young boy looking out of one of the doors. That's where I'm like, oh, I'm so desperate for answers. Is it real? Are ghosts real or are they not?
We're not going to get that.
Yeah, but it kind of just goes as far as footsteps, voices, and orbs. But there you have it. The Villisca Axe Murders, wild case.
That was just in its own, it's unique in its own way. But I put this in the frustrating category for sure.
Oh, yeah.
What a bunch of layers of BS that the family just had to go through before and after death, man.
Right. The insult to their memory of having 100 people or up to 100 people tramping through the house, fingerprinting it up. I mean, taking things, pieces of skull. What's happening? Is that a family heirloom now? Like, what are you doing with that?
It just doesn't even, it's absolutely a circus.
Yeah.
With a bunch of clowns, A
lot of clowns, dude.
It's
big
wild.
feet. Well, Task Force, this concludes the Villisca Axe Murders, but I would be remiss if I didn't shout out Christian over here, our man in the chair, our producer, and we've got a couple recordings from your mom who was at this house at one point in time.
We do. My mom actually visited this house like 3 or 4 weeks ago and did a daytime
that recently?
tour. Oh yeah, this was last month.
Whoa!
What?
Yeah, she did.
I thought this was like you had this like from years ago or something.
No, this was very, very recent. Yeah, she did a tour and a daytime tour by herself with the guide and took some recordings and heard some stuff, in my opinion.
Interesting. Well, while I'm thinking about the paranormal, one of the bonus videos we're going to upload on patreon.com/redweb today is actually a recording from Christian's mom, who went to the Villisca house and has a very eerie recording or two from there, kind of like an EVP. So Alfredo and I are going to blind react to that, see if we can debunk it, but also hear what she captured. So yeah, support us at patreon.com/redweb to get all that bonus material, get this show ad-free. And of course, it's the Movie Club month scare-a-thon to celebrate the Halloween season. For me, it's been going on since August because I'm a freak like that. But come over to Patreon, celebrate with us, and get 10% off an annual membership.
I'm that kind of freak, you know?
It's always the season for the spookies, from crap to classic. Whatever I said, I don't remember.
Yeah, man. Eating good in the month of October.
Gobbling up those candy goodnesses. You don't have to come to the Task Force HQ and knock on the door and say trick or treat. We're giving it out all month. And with that said, Fredo, I will see you right back here next Monday for yet another mystery.